By 1850, there were only two countries left in the Western Hemisphere that were importing significant number of enslaved people from Africa. These were Brazil and Cuba. Britain had tried to use diplomacy to stop them, but now it was time for the gloves to come off. This would culminate in the raid on Paranagua. Despite the best efforts of the West Africa Squadron, the Brazilian slave trade had reached new heights by 1848. There were between 300,000 and 400,000 enslaved people in Cuba, and between 2 million and 2.5 million in Brazil. This is more than double the number that there had been at the turn of the century. Unlike in Britain, where a faith in freedom had galvanized the country against the slave trade, there was little anti-slavery opinion in Brazil. By late 1849, there was a small anti-slavery faction that existed in Brazil that lost hope that there would ever be a peaceful end to the trade. Lord Palmerston agreed and gave up trying to negotiate a new treaty. Instead, he unleashed the Royal Navy. The Navy invaded the Bay of Saints and seized 2 ships off Salvador. A war of words erupted in the local newspapers between the pro-slavery press and the newspapers that were funded by Britain to print anti-slavery stories as part of their propaganda effort. In January 1850, a British Consul General delivered a letter from Palmerston back in London. You might have expected he was there to smooth the ruffled feathers. He wasn't. He was demanding the emancipation of all the Africans that had been illegally brought to Brazil. These made up about 40% of the country's enslaved population. To show he was serious, he endorsed new raids on suspected slavers, even if they were inside Brazilian territorial waters. The West Africa Squadron leapt into action. HMS Cormorant seized a steamer right in front of Sao Paulo on January the 2nd. They landed its crew on the beach and then set fire to the ship. On the H, HMS Rifleman did the same to another slaver. Then on the 10th, both Rifleman and Cormorant took prizes. The Rifleman's victim was a notorious slave steamer that had already made 4 successful trips to Brazil. She was so big that each time she would have between 12,000 and 15,000 enslaved Africans in her holds, and she was fast. The Rifleman had to chase her for 3 hours before they got her. She was captured and a prize crew put on board under the command of a young midshipman to take her to St. Helena to face judgment. The Rifleman and Cormorant shared the capture of a ship called the Estrella 2 days later, which was burned that same night. On June 9th, a ship tried to slip past the Cormorant while she was at anchor. The Cormorant gave chase. The slaver turned round and made a desperate dash for the safety of the harbour, but it was too late. It wasn't fast enough. The Cormorant fired her guns as a warning shot, then rammed her. This took down the slaver's mast and funnel. They boarded her within range of the fort that protected the harbour. These ships were joined by HMS Sharpshooter, which arrived off Rio on the 18th of June. She immediately captured a ship and sank it. She took a second vessel on the 20th, whilst looking for the admiral in charge of the squadron. They found him on the 22nd, and he issued them with new orders stating that nowhere was safe from them. They put this straight into action against a slave ship that was moored beneath the guns of a Brazilian fort. They seized it despite a flurry of musket shot from the shore. After that, Sharpshooter was sent north with Cormorant. They found a ship which only 17 days before had landed 700 enslaved Africans. The crew bragged that they had made 10 clear runs over the last 3 years, but this would be their last. After the crew was removed, the ship was set on fire and then used for target practice for the Sharpshooter's guns. This was the 6th capture by HMS Sharpshooter in little more than 3 months, at which point the British sent a note to the Brazilians, which was the imperial equivalent of mentioning how much better parts of their country would look with the Union Jack flying over them. But the Brazilian cabinet resisted, as they still hoped for diplomatic support from France or the United States. On June 26th, HMS Cormorant sent 2 boats into Cabo Frio to burn the brigantine rival, while angry crowds gathered on the shore. She then moved down the coast to Paranagua for what would be the conclusive action in this undeclared war. Cormorant arrived at the mouth of the river on the 29th of June. She passed the fort guarding the entrance and then proceeded into the bay. They found a group of suspicious ships moored off an island inhabited by slave dealers. 4 miles from the main trading port. She got as close as she could and then dispatched boats to seize them. One was an American ship, which was there to be fitted out for the trade. But as she did not yet have anything incriminating on board her, they had to let her go. Another was a vessel that both Cormorant and Rifleman had chased before. The crew of this one managed to scuttle her, taking her down to the bottom and out of the Cormorant's grasp. This left them with 3 prizes, which were taken in tow. They were heading out for the open sea, and then boom! The fort guarding the harbour entrance had fired on them. The fort's first shot was a warning shot. The next was not. Cormorant went at full steam ahead and returned fire. 5 shots smashed into her hull. 1 sailor was killed and 2 more were wounded. But the fort was in even worse condition after HMS Cormorant's 84-pounders had finished with it. The survivors could then only watch as the Cormorant set fire to 2 of her remaining prizes and headed back out to sea. Rio was soon seething with wild rumours of what had happened. Rumours circulated that the fort had been completely destroyed and that the Royal Navy was now preparing to bombard the capital itself. Some people said that the British were going to seize all of the slave ships and even take the crown jewels. A number of English sailors in the town were beaten up, but thankfully it did not go much further than that. On Monday, the 8th of July, the Brazilian Foreign Minister addressed Parliament about the British incursions. There was a tumultuous debate about the dangers of a war with Great Britain. The first full meeting of the Council of State since February was held on July the 11th to debate what they could do. Could they risk a war with Great Britain? Could they negotiate another treaty? Would another treaty even protect them? Brazil would later enter the First World War because a single ship had been attacked in Europe. It would officially join the Second World War in response to having 5 ships attacked on the high seas. HMS Cormorant had done more than that on her own, and she hadn't just done it inside Brazilian waters, she had done it inside Brazilian harbours. It seemed to the Brazilians that the British government had finally abandoned hope of persuading them to end the slave trade voluntarily and had decided to end it themselves, whatever the cost. Despite a good deal of fighting talk, it was clear that Brazil was powerless to resist the Royal Navy, and that the situation in the United States, caused by the admission of California into the Union, meant that they would not be getting any help from up there. Eventually, even staunch defenders of the trade realised that it was about to be crushed. The only question whether this was with or without a war with Great Britain. At the time, Brazil was already in war with Argentina, so it could not risk a war with one of the great powers as well. A new anti-slavery law was enacted on the 4th of September 1850. This time, unlike all of the previous laws, it was actually enforced. And the slave trade in Brazil came to a sudden, dramatic and permanent end. There was surprisingly little resistance from the slave-owning class. They accepted it because there was a glut of slaves on the market at the time, due to the massive amount of smuggling in the late 1840s, the same smuggling activity which had triggered the war in the first place. 23,000 enslaved people had been imported into Brazil in 1850. This dropped to 3,000 in 1851. By 1852, it was under 1,000. Palmerston declared that the Brazilian slave trade was over. Britain notified Brazil that it would withdraw their warships on April the 27th, 1852, on the condition that the slave trade did not bounce back. It didn't, and the last known attempt to land slaves was in 1855. Thanks to the naval action, slavery in Brazil was now doomed to die out. Diplomatic pressure then shifted to freeing the people who had been illegally imported since 1831. It did help speed up their emancipation, but because there were so many slaves in Brazil, it would take a long time before they were all free. The census of 1872 recorded 1.5 million slaves. Heading into the 1880s, there were still over 1 million slaves in Brazil. By 1887, this had reduced to 750,000. Then came a sudden collapse. The exodus of slaves from plantations began in 1887. It was encouraged by radical abolitionists led by Antonio Bento, but it was made possible by the Brazilian army. The army was no longer willing to force slaves to remain on plantations or to round up fugitives who had escaped. Even the powerful slave owners could now see the writing was on the wall. Their representatives in Parliament accepted that emancipation could no longer be avoided, and in May of 1888 the final Brazilian slaves were set free. This was only 2 years after the other major slave importer, Cuba, had freed its slaves, and next time we shall go over what had been going on up there.